Okay, welcome everyone to the Bradford seminar. Nothing could give me more pleasure than introducing the speaker today, my former colleague at EDF, Joe Goffman. The students who often, and I'm going to take my time here, so relax, sit back. For students who often ask me how they can plan a career like mine, I say, I was lucky. I never planned anything about my career. If you want a successful and consciously designed career aimed at identifying important environmental problems and then participating in solving them, no matter where the objective might take them, you should emulate Joe Goffman. Joe has an undergraduate and JD degree from Yale. He currently serves as Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation in the US EPA, where he oversees writing of the Clean Air Act regulations on greenhouse gases. Joe began his career with stints at Weill Gotshal, the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation, the Legal Aid Society, and Public Citizens Congress Watch. After that, Joe joined the Environmental Defense Fund staff, where at the time I directed the Climate and Air program. We worked closely on the acid rain issue and the Clean Air Act reauthorization in 1990, a giant step towards solving the acid rain problem. Joe left EDF to become Associate Counsel at the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee in 1989, where he worked drafting this very legislation. After the legislation was adopted, Joe came back to EDF to work with me, Dan Dudek, our Chief Economist, and Andy Petzog, who's now Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation, on the climate change issue, during which period he played a major role in securing the cap-and-trade provisions in the Kyoto Protocol. Joe left EDF again in 2005 to go into government as Environmental Counsel and Legislative Director for Joe Lieberman, Senator Joe Lieberman, where he worked on the McCain-Lieberman and Lieberman-Warner climate bills, and once again at the Environment and Public Works Committee as a majority senior counsel. Repeating the pattern, Joe was, repeating this pattern of learning an issue from one institutional perspective, then following it into another in order to hammer out the ideas that he had gleaned over that time into law. In other words, let's get the problem solved, assuming legislation actually does solve problems, which I'd like to hear your comment on. Then, repeating the pattern again, he went into the Obama administration as Assistant Administrator for Climate and the Senior Counsel to the Assistant Administrator at EPA. He left EPA in 2017 to serve as Democratic Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. In other words, he covered almost all the bases you would need to cover, at least ones that he was qualified for, in order to, really get a problem solved through government. Now that's an amazing career, right? One key to Joe's success is being as smart as anyone, but also being modest enough to give others the credit for his success. So you probably have never heard of him. Today, Joe's topic is wielding the tools of environmental policy, how regulatory rulemaking serves the climate, clean air, and the environmental justice agenda. Please join me with a wholehearted welcome to Joe
Goffman. Thank you, Michael, and thank you for inviting me here. That was really a lovely introduction. I appreciate the fact that when you prepared that introduction, Michael, you took the trouble to have a seance with my late mother, because only my mother would believe that stuff about me. Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'm glad you showed her. I'm glad you showed her ghost respect by repeating what she said. Because of the nature of my work and the demands of my schedule, I do, events like this, and in my case, a trip up from Washington, D.C. overnight. I really can't afford to do it very often. But for Michael Oppenheimer, I will do absolutely anything. Something that I am glad that he did not know for the last 10 or 15 years, because this is really the first time in a long time you've asked me to do something. And I couldn't have been more delighted, Michael, when I received your email this summer and was given this opportunity. Of course, my second delight is being able to spend time with all of you, and I hope, among other things, be able to convey to you how rewarding spending a life doing this kind of work can be, whether it's in the advocacy community, in the research community, or in government. And if, I don't know, a year from now, 2, 3 years from now, I discover that one or two of you are working at the Environmental Protection Agency Office of Air and Radiation, I will be very happy that in addition to helping Michael pursue his mission here at Princeton, I've done something good for the Environmental Protection Agency. I really have learned to benefit from, okay, is this a little bit better? I've really learned to benefit from the privilege of being supported by 2,300 career staff in the Office of Air and Radiation, as well as many, many experts and attorneys in other parts of the EPA and the executive branch. And so I've learned to really, quote a professional basketball club's executive, trust the process. Unfortunately, I had a longer train ride than I expected. And so while one of my expert communications colleagues prepared a wonderful PowerPoint presentation, against my better judgment, I revised it on the train. So it's a little bit kludgy. You'll have to bear with me. And of course, there you go. What I hope to be able to do in the next few minutes in laying out sort of an opening presentation and then answering questions or taking on your thoughts that might be constructive to share is really explain how broad policy objectives and priorities of the kind set by a president gets translated into action through existing tools provided in the first instance by Congress, and then augmented by the process that agencies like the EPA put in place, and the expertise that the agency accumulates, often through a very much a collective process. And that includes engagement with outside stakeholders, ranging from community advocates to the industries that our regulations address or touch. So as you can see from this quote, this is an executive order that President Biden signed within hours of having been sworn in on January 20th, 2021. And I happen to know from personal experience, because I served on the Biden-Harris transition team, and maybe even, according to some rumors, had something to do with the drafting of this executive order. I happen to know that this executive order was in the works for months, because President Biden and his senior advisors really wanted to make it absolutely clear, and how much clearer can you make something than signing it within hours of being sworn in, what one of his key categories of priorities are, which was to address climate change and to deliver a level of benefit and protection to what are referred to as environmental justice communities. But we're really talking about our fellow citizens, our fellow Americans, if you will, who live in communities that are extensively burdened by a number of challenges, including degraded air quality, or air quality degraded by pollution. And so the president made it clear that this is something that he wanted his executive branch agencies to do. If you are somebody who works in the Office of Air and Radiation, you're inclined to say, well, to some extent he came to the right place when part of this executive order was directed specifically at Clean Air Act regulation, which the Office of Air and Radiation is responsible for implementing. What I'm going to try to cover, if there's enough time, is how we took that executive order, which is not the only directive that comes to us. The Clean Air Act itself is a directive, and it's a continual, like a perpetual motion machine. It directs the Office of Air and Radiation to continually renew and refresh and renovate as the economy and technology and science change. So the President's executive order, vintage January 2021, and Congress's direction, vintage 1990, really work very closely together in harmony. All right, let me move on to the next slide. Now, when I say that the President came to the right place when he directed the Environmental Protection Agency more broadly and the Office of Air and Radiation implicitly, but clearly, to tackle the problem of climate pollution and air toxics pollution and pollutants that affect air quality. The reason I say he came to the right place is that EPA has been implementing the Clean Air Act for decades now. First of all, if you're an EPA person, you're not allowed to go out into public without showing the slide, which we refer to, guess why, as the baby slide. But what this really demonstrates is that what Congress intended the Clean Air Act to do, which is to reduce pollution and improve air quality in the context of ongoing economic change and growth, is an enterprise that's been largely successful and certainly durable as air quality has improved over the decades while the population has grown and the economy has grown. In other words, long before President Biden came into office and directed us to undertake a new set of initiatives by way of regulation to address air quality and climate change, the Clean Air Act had demonstrated again and again that the tools it provided for dealing with air quality problems were robust, were durable, and were effective. So let's look at some of the things we're doing in terms of addressing climate. I have confidence, but I can't guarantee it, but I have confidence that before this year is over, the EPA will finalize a comprehensive program to address methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. The agency did 2 rounds of proposals to address methane from the oil and gas sector. And we issued the first one in November of 2021. We issued if you will, the follow-up proposal, which we refer to as a supplemental proposal, because that's just administrative law speak, in November of 2022. And the first proposal really was intended to invite or induce the delivery of more information from the industry and from other expert sources, as well as from stakeholders and communities, particularly frontline communities that host, if you will, oil and gas operations. One of the things that we were able to do in the second proposal was really put together, at least propose answers to some of the more challenging questions that come up when it comes to regulating this sector. As you can see, the oil and gas sector is the biggest source of methane emissions, and I think everybody knows that methane is a significant greenhouse gas and climate forcer. And so reducing methane emissions in the near term can be highly efficacious when it comes to addressing climate change. The supplemental proposal, that is the second proposal, or proposal version 2.0, which we issued in November of last year, would achieve, as you can see on the slide, we project that the proposal, if finalized, would achieve significant reductions in methane emissions, and the activity and technology used to reduce methane emissions, we also project will reduce volatile organic compounds which affect air quality, as well as air toxics. So this is a proposal that has significant benefits. A couple of other things to mention about it. The proposal includes at least two fairly significant innovations. One is an approach to promoting what industry tells us and has been able to substantiate is a very significant opportunity to continually improve the technology that detects methane emissions, particularly fugitive emissions. The other innovative proposal is to address what I think many know as super emitters or super emitter events. And Michael, feel free to validate, because I think research over the last 10 years and studies, particularly empirical studies of the major oil and gas producing basins in this country, consistently identify or detect substantially more methane emissions than would be predicted simply by using point of emissions or source monitoring and reporting. And so we felt that it was important to do some outside-the-box thinking in order to get at super-emitting events. What we proposed is a system whereby qualified third parties using certified or qualified detection technologies could identify major emissions events that we identified as meeting the definition of super emission events, report their findings to the operator where the super emitting events occur, and thereby trigger an obligation on the part of the operator to investigate the event, and once the operator identified the problem, fix it. And as you can see just from this diagram, you can see all of the components of the production, processing, and transmission system within the oil and gas sector that either we are proposing to regulate directly or which could be sources of methane escapes, or what is known as fugitive emissions. So being able to deploy as many different resources as possible to get at the problem, beyond just this, which is the, if you will, I hate to put it like this, the laundry list of specific sources and processes that we are establishing standards for directly. To get beyond that, since we know that there are super emission events that we can't necessarily fully account for through direct regulation, is an important part of the mission. When we finalize these rules, we will be not only including the super emitter program, but we will be taking account of some of the expert advice we got as to how to enhance the chances that it will really work. As you can tell, an amateur produced this slide because it's a little bit kludgy, but one of the reasons that I thought it would be useful to put up is that it's a sort of visual representation of the problem we're talking about. The photograph in the lower right-hand corner is produced by optical gas imaging. It's invisible to the naked eye, but that's very much where the action is. And what we're hoping to do, what we designed the proposal to do and intend to finalize, is to create not only the super emitter strategy that I described, but also a strategy that would really promote technological innovation to continually improve how these events are detected. The industry has credibly documented that it's made major investments in improving technology, and we have proposed and plan to finalize a system whereby innovative technologies can be certified and deemed a form of compliance with the program. So one thing to observe is that everything I just described represents, in addition to the two innovative categories, otherwise represents a conventional, historically validated application of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act, under the section of the Clean Air Act we're using, authorizes and in many cases requires us to identify what's called the best system of emission reduction, which is basically says, if there's a technology that meets certain criteria of practicality and effectiveness that can be applied to a source to reduce the emissions of a particular pollutant or the pollutant you're regulating, then EPA can set a standard for that class of sources based on that technology. And really, that's what we've done here with our two rounds of oil and gas methane proposals. So when I say the president came to the right place when he identified EPA and the Office of Air and Radiation and the application of the Clean Air Act toolbox when it came to methane, that's what I'm referring to. As you all know, another significant source of greenhouse gas is the transportation sector. And in the spring of this year, we proposed a set of standards for greenhouse gas and other pollutant emissions from new cars and light-duty trucks. That proposal is based on our identifying electrification technology, that is EVs, as meeting the legal or statutory and technical criteria on which we can base a standard. We're doing this at a time where we're benefiting from two significant drivers. One is that a number of the major auto manufacturers have made it public that they plan to continue what they've already done, which is make significant investments in electric vehicles, from upstream components to manufacturing to marketing. Their decision is very much reflected, or those investments are very much reflected in the legislation that was passed in the summer of 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act, and to some extent reflected in a previous piece of legislation, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, where Congress put specific provisions in place to foster additional investment to supplement, reinforce, and even catalyze further what a number of the automobile companies have already done by way of investment. And that allowed us to recognize the availability of EVs in the new car fleet as a legal and technical basis for setting very stringent standards. And as you can see on this slide, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, have a host of ways of supporting battery manufacturing, critical mineral investments and operations, and reducing costs to consumers, or reducing costs through the tax code to a combination of the consumers and the manufacturers. And under the Clean Air Act, we, as we proposed in the spring, are authorized to take account of all that in setting tailpipe emission standards for CO2. Now this slide is probably completely illegible to you, but I put it up there just to sort of illustrate a particular point, which is that the regulation that we proposed simply specifies that from model year 2027 and each model year thereafter through model year 2032, new car fleets have to collectively meet an increasingly stringent CO2 grams per mile standard. The regulation does not mandate a particular technology, but to be sure, we determine the grams per mile standard by taking account of the widespread availability and feasibility of increasing that availability of EVs. And as you'll see from this next illegible slide, we do project for each model year increasing penetrations of electric vehicles in the new car fleet. And now to the third illegible slide. When we proposed these grams per mile standards for each of those 6 model years, 27 through 2032, we actually offered the public and stakeholders 3 additional options to comment on. So we had one proposal in 3 different scenarios, because what we knew at the time is that there was even more information out there about how quickly it would be reasonable to ask the new car economy, whether it's manufacturers or consumers, to absorb the progressively increasing tightening of these CO2 standards, or in practical effect, increasing penetration of EVs in the new car fleet. And I will tell you that we put the proposal out. There was a formal comment period, which closed several months ago. And one of the things I can observe from the comment period is that what we proposed and the three variations of it were generally well accepted, at least as a threshold question, by a full range of stakeholders, including the manufacturers. And what putting four different options out really allowed us to do was to hone in on what I would say is some of the trickiest part of landing a regulation like this, is figuring out just how much lead time the transportation economy, the manufacturers and the installers of infrastructure that would be needed could reasonably project it would require to reach different levels of EV penetration. And so when we finalize this rule, which we hope to do next spring, what you'll see is standards within this range of options that reflect not only what we project to be the ability of this technology to penetrate the new car fleet, but the kind of timing and lead time that the manufacturers and transportation economy overall will require. We didn't stop at light-duty and medium-duty cars when proposing regulations for the on-road transportation sector. We also proposed greenhouse gas standards for heavy-duty vehicles. These are sort of medium-sized trucks all the way up to 18-wheelers. Now, you probably didn't catch this a minute ago when I said that the car and light truck standards covered not only greenhouse gases, but air quality pollutants as well. In the case of heavy-duty vehicles, we had proposed what I would say is a very effective and ambitious conventional pollutant rulemaking at the end of 2022, which I'll talk about a little bit if there's time, which is already in place. And now we're sort of finishing the job by setting greenhouse gas standards. I will tell you that the heavy-duty manufacturing economy is far less advanced when it comes to electrification than light-duty vehicles. And the nature of the business that truck manufacturers are in is significantly different from the nature of the business that car manufacturers are in, because their customers are not consumers, but they're, if you will, other businesses that purchase, operate, and manage fleets. And the level of acceptance of electrification technology is, a good, if you will, generation behind the level of acceptance of electrification for cars. And so if you look at the two different proposals, you'll see that they're quite different. Again, we offered the public two different options to consider, and this is just illustrative of the two different options. They're both, I think, from the perspective of the industry, and by that I mean not just the manufacturers of trucks, but the businesses that purchase and use trucks. The level of acceptance is not nearly as warm as the acceptance of the light-duty vehicle or car proposal. So I've covered two sectors that are critical to climate policy: the oil and gas sector and the transportation sector. On to the power sector. Now, even before the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, there were many, many drivers of decarbonization in the electricity sector. And as this also indecipherable slide purports to illustrate, with the Inflation Reduction Act being enacted and implemented, we're projecting that without further regulation, we will be seeing a fairly significant decarbonization of the electricity sector. So what's the purpose, what's the function of establishing, under the Clean Air Act, CO2 standards for the power sector? Well, the purpose is to take advantage of an opportunity that EPA has rarely had when establishing pollution standards, and that is to establish pollution standards, and I think perhaps you saw this when I was describing the interaction between the IRA, the BIL, and our light-duty vehicle rule, but it's certainly true here in the power sector. There's a way to sort of fashion these regulations while observing all of the limits and extent of our legal authority under the Clean Air Act, and observing the limits and extent of support in the analytic record that we must rely on. There's also an opportunity to analyze all that while the other parts of the government are deliberately and concertedly, again, mostly in the form of these two pieces of legislation, deliberately and concertedly establishing a kind of global or broad-based policy for decarbonization. So as we process the public comments that came in response to our proposal in May to set CO2 standards for new natural gas plants, existing natural gas plants, and existing coal plants, what we want to do is establish ambitious and stringent standards consistent with our legal authority and consistent with what technologies are available. But understand that from the day the administrator signs the rule going forward, these standards have a tremendous opportunity to work in synergy or synchronicity or harmony with the policy embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that as we look at the comments we got back, look at the technical record that we're building through those comments and otherwise to support a set of final standards, certainly as a, if you will, policymaker, I'm thinking that we need to think strategically about how all these different drivers work together to, if you will, maximize decarbonization while meeting the standard policy criteria in this area, which is cost and affordability and system reliability. I will say that if you sort of look at our spring proposal, when you look at the three components of it, new gas, existing coal, we got a very much a mixed reaction, including on the technical level from the utility industry, particularly about the way we propose to approach decarbonizing the existing natural gas fleet. We also got some very significant feedback from advocates who advocate on behalf of environmental justice communities, not only about some of the technological choices we made vis-a-vis reducing carbon, but also noting that while in the last 2 or 3 years, or some would say in the last 10 or 12 years, EPA has been methodical in expanding its regulatory envelope, if you will, to address conventional air quality and toxic air emissions from coal-fired power plants. According to a number of advocates and experts, we have a lot of unfinished business with respect to air quality and air toxics when it comes to the natural gas fleet. So we're going to be, let's just say at this point, thinking hard about how we move what we proposed for the existing gas fleet to what we finalize, and how we can, in the course of doing that, accommodate or account for or address the unfinished business when it comes to the impact of natural gas on air quality and air toxics. So that's the climate agenda. And I will jump past this slide. You saw in that quote that one of the things that the president elevated on his first few hours in office was public health and environmental justice. And I'll just quickly flag and stop talking long enough to let others get a word in edgewise, that, as I mentioned, at the end of 2022, we established a set of conventional pollutant standards for heavy-duty vehicles. And mostly those vehicles are powered by diesel engines, which have a significant air quality impact, particularly for the tens of millions of people who live near major thoroughfares, many of whom are in the, if you will, the demographic group that we think of as where we have to make progress in providing environmental justice. And so simply getting our arms around and establishing cleanup standards for new heavy-duty vehicles over time will provide significant air quality benefits to those people and those communities. But another major tool we have is the ability to set emission standards for toxic air emissions. Often that part of the Clean Air Act has us focusing very narrowly on specific sectors and specific sets of pollutants. And often a successful air toxics program for a specific sector is measured in pounds of air toxics reductions. And in this case, our chemical industry proposal, which also came out in the spring of this year, addresses a broad swath of chemical manufacturing plants, and we are projecting that the air toxics reductions will be measured in thousands of tons, which is a real considered historically a very significant impact on air toxics exposure. And as you can see, communities in what many people refer to as the cancer belt along the Gulf and in Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley will benefit from these reductions when we finalize them. There you can see in Texas there's a significant chemical industry footprint in very high population areas. Similarly, you can see that sort of necklace of chemical plants in Louisiana, all of which will achieve significant reductions in CO2 and significant reductions in cancer and other illness risk to the populations that live near them, many of which, again, are in what fall into the category of environmental justice communities. I'll conclude with just one more observation about this particular rule. People in those communities and the experts they rely on and we rely on have identified the next frontier as addressing cumulative risk. It's not just one pollutant. It's not just one industry or source in a community. There are multiple sources in the community, in these communities. And what you can see here is our attempt, our very first attempt analytically to identify how this particular set of regulations and air toxics reductions for the universe of sources covered by the rule, what kind of progress it makes in reducing the cumulative risk in the communities that, if you will, host these facilities. As you can see from the bar charts on the right, we think we can claim that this particular regulation in the communities affected by these sources will see a significant reduction, not only in risk, cancer and illness risk directly related to the chemicals we're regulating and the sources we're regulating, but to other sources within those airsheds. I think it's time for me to turn the floor over to Michael and others who might have questions.
really EPA's role has changed a lot because of all this bigger context that's happening at the same time. How do you, as a regulator, so to speak, how do you feel about that? Is that, on the one hand, it looks like a good thing because all of a sudden the government can chew and walk up, whatever.
Yeah, walking.
They can do two things, two entirely different things at once. And I don't know if in the environmental regulatory field there's a precedent for that. On the other hand, you could say, well, wait a minute, maybe EPA will lose its edge in all this because at least in the utility case, you're a backstop. And even in the power plant, in the transportation case, there's a lot bigger context going on there. So step back a minute, and how do you feel about the future of EPA as a regulator in that context?
Well, I know you won't be surprised if I give you what sounds like an institutionally self-serving answer. So I'm not going to surprise you. I'm going to say two things. One, kind of to set the stage. Our job is to implement the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act is very, very specific about the legal and technical pathways that are available to us. The Supreme Court got even more specific, some would say, but the pathways available to us to start with a source of pollution, a set of pollutants, technologies to reduce them, and our job is to, within our legal authority and within what the analytic and technical record we build supports, is to set standards. What I think we are seeing this regulatory toolbox as now has acquired a certain property or set of properties because of these other actions, which is to sort of render these standards both complementary and of these other policies, but also as being somewhat higher leverage, right? An example, I think, is of what we proposed for cars, greenhouse gases from cars. We think that even before the Inflation Reduction Act, there was ample basis to project and base the grams per mile standard on a medium-term future in which electrification was the most cost-effective way, and that's a sort of term of art that is within the box with which we operate, the most cost-effective way to reduce CO2 emissions. And so we would, in the absence of the Inflation Reduction Act, use the record we had and the projections we had to set 6 mile years worth of standards. The Inflation Reduction Act actually solves for cost and availability of technologies that are instrumental both to the manufacturing of EVs at a more affordable level and to the consumer uptake of EVs, so that we can simply look at that new reality and set standards that reflect it. So that, that's a really complicated way, but hey, I'm at Princeton, of saying we can do more because Congress said we're putting resources into the transportation economy that will do more. And what a great opportunity to set standards that will require more. So they work in harmony. One, I don't know which arrow the leverage construct points in, whether it's from the IRA to our regulations or back in the other direction. But there's a much broader, there's a much broader set of forces, pushing towards electrification.
Sounds like a good thing.
Yeah.
Questions? Jeff?
One of the pushbacks we've seen from industry to the power plant rules is the fact that both for carbon capture and hydrogen, which are two of the main compliance options, you need a network, to deal with that. You need somewhere to take the CO2 and inject it safely somewhere to get the hydrogen from, which maybe makes it a little bit different than some other
emission, arguably than some other pollution controls where you're dependent on the actions of a broader industry. How does that enter into your thinking? What would you sort of say in response to that kind of line of argument that it's not fair to require us to do this because I got to depend on somebody else to get the job done?
Well, that's certainly a telling point that we have to respond to. And in fact, I would argue that our proposal, which again sets a CO2 standard for what comes off of the source, that we derive from identifying a set of technologies that meet, basically feasibility and cost effectiveness tests. In our proposal, we attempted to account for that. And I think at a very high level, we took it as not just, but thought about it the way we always think about the supply of what you need to make a particular technology work and be broadly applicable. I think if you go back and look at some of our other regulations that involve, technology applications, at the smokestack, in there we established the compliance time horizon based on the kind of supplies that were needed. I'm thinking of the mercury and air toxic standards, which required, labor to install the equipment and supplies of various chemicals to make the system work. Yes, there's definitely a difference in kind on one level between the supply of perishables like chemicals to add to a boiler or a smokestack and infrastructure. But at the end of the day, I think we see that as on a continuum. So in the proposal, we didn't just offer a one-size-fits-all solution. We, attempted to identify different profiles for how power plants operate and how they're dispatched and what their planned remaining useful life is. And we applied a cost-effectiveness test based on those factors. And in that sense, required different things for different categories. And so when you look at the CCS and hydrogen, for example, the demand for that, according to our proposal, is modest enough to be able to project that over the time horizon, the infrastructure will be there. Now, of course, we got a lot of informative comments and a lot of very useful information that we didn't have as of May of 2023 that we're certainly going to reflect when we finalize it.
Thank you. I want to go back to your answer to Michael's question that there's clear synergy between the energy space and environmental regulation. So I think at a high level, it all looks good. But when you're really looking at the implementation, a lot of states and local government are really struggling to make decisions quickly, thinking about giving out a tax credit, like EV tax credit, but at the same time thinking about like state implementation plan for air quality. So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how can we better support states and local actors to really embrace this window of opportunity and design this integrated decision that's good for energy, for climate, for everything.
Well, that's a great question, and I from the Office of Air and Radiation perspective, it goes right to something we're trying to do, because I didn't have a chance to talk about this, but Congress gave the executive branch a lot of money to give directly to states and local governments. Not just tax incentives for consumers or for battery plant builders and if you will, capital and consumption. But an example of a solution is a program called the Climate Pollution Reduction Program. It's a grant program. The Office of Air and Radiation administers it. And I feel a little embarrassed for forgetting whether this was part of the, well, I think it was part of the statutory design, but we implemented it in a particular way. We have two different pots of money to distribute. A smaller pot of money for so-called planning grants, and then those planning grants will support, among other things, the application for much larger implementation grants once states and municipalities submit a plan. One of the things that we identified as an important set of criteria for applications coming in, we want to see, or we encouraged or even required states and localities to use their planning grant resources to develop plans that leverage other forms of Inflation Reduction Act funding. So that essentially we try to structure it so that we would structure in synergies with a range of IRA programs, we encouraged the states to use the planning grant money to develop applications that that themselves have support projects with a broader footprint. So I think to give you a bureaucratic answer, there's a big fat compartment that the IRA added to the toolbox that I think in part goes to your question.
Hi, I'm wondering if you opened up your presentation with environmental justice, and when you were talking about the heavy-duty trucks, you mentioned industry. You did mention where environmental justice stands on those draft rules, and they are in draft rules, and so I'm curious what your office is doing to prioritize environmental justice in a regulatory space, both within the greenhouse gas and the energy sector and within the heavy-duty truck sector, when thousands of comments have been sent, research reports all arguing the demands that are coming from those communities, but where engagement is still very much limited to, well, there was a public comment hearing, and there hasn't really been any other engagement on how to incorporate those comments into strengthening those rules.
Well, that's a central, that's one of the central tasks we're working on now. The heavy duty, I'll put it in somewhat, broad terms. We finalized the standard at the end of last year for heavy duty NOx, which presupposed that the new truck fleets would continue to be diesel engines and gasoline engines. Just the economics to continue demand for that are very strong. So we had to account for ensuring that, as these diesels and gasoline engines continue to be manufactured and purchased, we had to set if you will, an air quality standard. Or we had to set a conventional pollutant standard, and we prioritized that rulemaking rather than, say, waiting to do a multi-pollutant rule, because there's a significant impact on EJ communities of heavy-duty vehicles. Now we get a second bite at the apple. We proposed greenhouse gas standards for heavy-duty vehicles. And I think there's, I'll put it in stark terms, there's a conflict between where we need to end up in terms of new truck standards and the extent to which the record supports those standards. The Clean Air Act is, I think it's fair to describe it, it's not oversimplifying, is a bottom-up authority. With one exception, Congress did not authorize us, it's just beyond scope, when we set technology standards to a priori select an endpoint, like, let's say, 100% electric vehicles in the heavy-duty fleet by a certain time. What Congress did authorize us to do is to look at the available technology, look at its cost effectiveness, its feasibility, its compatibility with the business we're regulating, and build the path to that. So what we proposed in the spring is what we think is as far as we can go with the record we have to extend that path. And I believe a number of environmental justice communities and their advocates are objecting strenuously to the fact that that path does not get all the way to 100% electrification in the medium term. And that's not because we reject that as a policy outcome. On the contrary, we support it. But when you have what's only a bottom-up authority, you can only use the authority based on what the record shows.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. It has been great to see you, and assemble a great team. Even though in the past I have been outside the agency, advocating and pushing, it's really remarkable what this administration has done. So I commend you for that. My question was a little bit more on the personal side. You have been an advocate. You have been a regulator, and many students, as they embark in their careers, I was wondering if you could give a little more insights, into how do you say the different hats that you have worn, and what is most fulfilling, and any advice that you can offer to more students?
Well, I think there's, it sort of depends on what, it depends on what part of your temperament is most, it resonates most with different places to operate. One of the things that is a key feature of working in government, or several of the things are, there's no place to be in the policy universe that will allow you to get more information more quickly and more easily than in government. So if you have a curiosity, if you really like learning stuff, if you really think that the power of good decision making relies on information, then just on a sort of personal level, if that's your temperament, government's the place to be. On the other hand, I think in some ways, and the question I just answered is a perfect illustration of that, is the policy objectives and your sort of your own, if you will, your own personal commitments are very much modulated by the process. I know that I have personal, and having been an advocate and also having worked on the Hill, I've had an opportunity to walk my preferences. I have preferences that are of a certain character. In government, I have to really modulate those preferences to, as I said in the previous answer, my job is to build the path, and in many ways, that can be very satisfying. It's of course frustrating because I think there are legal systems in which regulators could be authorized and empowered to establish mandates. I think our colleagues in California operate within the envelope of state law in that kind of legal system, but the trade-off for somebody like me, and I think I imagine other people, is that you end up building something quite durable if you ultimately embrace the sort of pathway building template that you know, that the legal mandates and constraints of the Clean Air Act, you know, essentially, you know, compel you to do.